Hey everyone, this is the SIG-AUTH meeting for May 25th, 2022. We have a relatively light agenda today, just 2 items, so that we can get started. Joe is still trying to figure out audio stuff, so we'll skip that for a second and talk about TMS. So Jordan, you and Rita are the only other leads on the call right now, but I think the gist of the meeting that Rita, myself, and Nish, Christoph, and others had yesterday was that we need a reviewer / approver for this one of us.
All right, I'm back.
Maybe we can pause that conversation and let Joe have the floor. Do you still have co-host? You do still have co-host. We can talk about self for a bit, and then we'll get back to Canvas.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for waiting while I sorted out my machine. Yeah, so my name is Joe Betts. I work mostly on SIG API machinery. We've been working on something called Self for a while, and it came to my attention talking to Tim and Jordan and some others that there might be people in SIG-AUTH that are just interested in hearing about it and asking questions. So I don't have like a full presentation, but if somebody can give me screen sharing, I can show a couple of visual aids to kind of explain what we've done and kind of summarize where it's going.
Try now.
Awesome, thank you. Let's share a window. Actually, tab. All right.
JP, I think you're muted if you're talking.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah, I can hear you now. Just couldn't hear you while you were screen sharing.
Yeah, sorry. Let me see if I can do both at the same time. Something magical happened.
You get like muted when you start screen sharing, like on Zoom.
Yeah, I'm seeing that. Let me try sharing just a window. Maybe it's because I'm sharing a tab. I don't know Zoom. Sorry.
You should get one of those fancy computers that can show pictures and do audio at the same time. I hear they're all the rage.
That sounds amazing. All right, can anybody see this?
Yes, and we can hear you.
Yep.
All right. Apparently sharing the tab is what kills me. So anyways, Cell is this really simple embedded expression language. It's non-Turing complete, and it has some properties that make it safe to run in an embedded environment. But it's comprehensive enough that you can do a lot of really useful things for it with it. So you can, if you have an object, you can access fields of that object. You can do a lot of conditionals. You can even construct objects if you've taught the system about that object. So it's actually pretty powerful, and but constrained enough that we think it's safe to do things like embed in the API server. So what we did in the last couple of releases for SIG API machinery was put it inside of CRDs. So now, in addition to all the other ways that you can make a CRD type safe and you can add basic validation rules, you can now add expressions. And you can do fairly sophisticated things because you can access multiple fields. So this is a simple example where you're saying that your min value has to be less than your max value, which otherwise would have been expected but not enforced. The alternative to doing it this way would have, of course, been to put it in maybe a validating admission controller, probably a webhook, with all the like operational and developer complexity that involves compared to like this one line here. The other alternative that I actually see people do a lot in CRDs is they don't want to have a webhook. So any additional rules that they have, they just put in their controller. But that, of course, means that the error is shifted pretty far right, and you don't often, as a developer, get to see the error as soon as you would have liked to. So that's kind of what Cell is at a really basic level, and that's the first thing we're doing in Kubernetes with it. We are also interested in doing more general admission with it. That is something that we're going to be looking at in 126 and on. The idea being that you might actually be able to write an admission control rule that makes sure that your namespace has like the right labels or other things that you might want to check with an admission controller. You're going to be able to do that without necessarily having to go out to a webhook. You could just write the rule directly into it. I can show what, I don't know. It could look something as simple as this, where instead of having a bunch of information about a webhook that you're going to call to make a decision on whether something's allowed through, you just say what the rule is that you're going to check.
Joe, question on the CRD stuff.
Yep.
What's the stability of cell in that use case, that first one?
So Cell is, it's already, it's an open source project. It is Google developed. It is used in a lot of different projects already. And the developers are very concerned with stability. So it's got a fairly exhaustive test set. And the use cases that it's already got mean that the language probably is going to see very, very controlled, constrained changes over time. Is that the question you're asking?
Part of it, the other part is like, for example, what Kubernetes version do I need to be able to use this field on the security?
Right.
And yeah, what are the constraints?
Yeah, it's an alpha in 1.23 and 1.24. And it's going to go to beta in 1.25, targeting, yeah.
Yeah. So since it's alpha, that would mean that there's some feature flag that has to be enabled on the
right.
Within that same vein, I guess maybe this is a little bit too specific. Say I'm a project that wants to adopt that in my CRDs. I don't really know if my target systems have it, like target API servers. Can I set that field and just kind of hope it might get used or not, and like be okay with it not being used?
At one, like, yes, you can. The constraints are in 123 and 124, even if you don't have the flag on, if the field's there, you're not going to break anything. It's just not going to do anything.
You'll have more relaxed validation than you expected.
Yeah.
So say in 125, when it's in beta, you started creating CRDs, and some of your users were still on 123 and 124. They wouldn't get the benefit of your change, but they wouldn't be broken.
But if they're on 122, the CRD would fail.
The CRD would fail.
Yeah, because kube control says you have a field in your manifest that I can't find in the open API. So this is an unknown field.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you.
Yep. There's a couple interesting things. If you want, I could talk more about CRDs. I'm also interested in kind of learning if there are other use cases in other systems where people are interested in this, where it might fit in, if people have questions.
I do, but I don't want to keep beating you the only one talking, so someone else can.
That question about mutation.
Yeah, what's your question about mutation?
Who's in the chat?
Yeah,
I was asking a question about mutation. How we would really like to get rid of our webhook, but we also have like the mutation part. So I was wondering how realistic is it that it would be possible to use cell for that at some point?
At some point makes it easier for me to say maybe yes. What we're planning to do is we're planning to do validating admission control first, because it's a much more constrained problem, and use that as a way of figuring out a lot of the details and getting this right. And then if that goes well, then look into mutating admission control. Cell does have what we need to do mutations. You can return an object, you can return a new field that would replace something else. So it is feasible to use it to do mutations at least at the very basic level. But how that looks in a YAML object where you're declaring a mutation hasn't been figured out yet. So I would expect that to be quite a bit further out. Definitely not this year.
There's basically a progression of complexity with cell. So individual validation rules inside a custom resource were the most constrained case, where the expression just evaluates to a Boolean, like good, bad. And it's paired with a specific schema so that all the type checking stuff that cell gives you, we could apply and make sure that the rule that you're specifying actually maps to fields that are good, and the operations you're doing exist for those types. So this is super constrained. Like expanding that to validating admission, you start to get cases where we might not be able to do type checking of the expression. If you're saying this is going to intercept like pods and some custom resource as well, like we might not have the schema available, or the schema might change in the future. And so we start having to apply expressions dynamically to things like at runtime, instead of being able to type check them at like when you write this configuration. And webhooks do more than just return Booleans. They can also like return warnings and return audit annotations. And so figuring out how you would do things like make an admission decision, yes or no, but then also like emit warnings or audit annotations. We would like this to have parity with other types of admission. And then, like Joe said, mutation adds like one more thing on top of that. Like in addition to a yes, no decision, maybe warnings, maybe annotations, you would also be including mutations. So that's why this is the order we went in.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Jordan. There was a question about WASM. WASM was an alternative that we considered when we were looking at this problem space. And one of the reasons I have a slide about WASM in this little deck that I'm using as a visual aid is sometimes people ask me, why didn't you just give WASM? And the answer is, I think while WASM is interesting, it's a very different primitive that solves very different problems well. So for example, when you're embedding these expressions in here, it's just part of the YAML. And everybody knows which language we're using. If we're consistent about it, that means that you could start to build a community that's pretty familiar with these. And honestly, there's such basic C-style, grammar that most people don't even need to like blink to figure out what this expression means. And that's pretty common across CEL. If you were instead to try and use WASM, presumably what you'd be doing is you'd be having some kind of build chain somewhere that produces a WASM binary, which then has to go somewhere. They're almost certainly not going to fit embedded into the YAML. I think a minimum go size for a WASM blob is 1.9 megabytes, which is already too big. And so then presumably what you'd have to be doing is saying, well, I've got this blob somewhere, which is a WASM thing, so I could give coordinates to it, and then the API server would have to somehow load in that blob and have access to load it, and then it would have to have an entry point into it. It's not that you can't do stuff like that, not that you wouldn't get benefits of running something inside the API server, but it's a very different developer experience, and it's a very different operational experience than just having these embedded strings. And what we've seen a lot for a lot of use cases is typically what people are doing do fit into one-liner cases, even for admission. Typically what people want to do is express something fairly straightforward.
Gotcha. So the WASM one is just sort of hypothetical, not something we're actually targeting, right?
That's right. This is a alternative considered, so to speak, here. We want to tell people that we thought about it, and we want to have a good explanation as to like what that would look like, but that's not what we're doing. Let's see, I have another question. How did we manage release cadence of CEL admission kernel given that it is in lock cadence with Kubernetes release cadence? I'm not sure I understand the question. Is this about the changes to CEL itself in relationship to Kubernetes?
Yeah. Sorry,
That's a
that
really
should have
good
been
question.
more clear.
Oh, that makes sense. So yes, we've thought about this. So some good news is the CEL community is very cognizant to the fact that this is being used embedded in other systems, and it affects their API surface area. So a change to CEL could be basically any change to CEL is going to be breaking, because if you add a new feature, even if it was backwards compatible, kind of so to speak in the language terms, any system that doesn't recognize it would presumably not be able to execute it right. So we are aware that CEL may add new things in the future, but we're working with them to make sure that we have ways to kind of control what's turned on over time. And we also we're also thinking, I don't know, Jordan, should I get into ratcheting here, how that's going to potentially work as some of the mechanisms? We're also thinking about what happens when they do introduce a breaking change, or we do introduce a library, so that we can kind of incrementally roll it out and make it available, but still give some way where there's some safety net.
Yeah, I mean, the only types of changes being contemplated in Cell are ones that allow more things than are currently allowed. Like things that are currently errors could become understood by Cell in the future. And so to roll that out safely would require us to sort of tolerate the more relaxed Cell expressions for one release, and then allow data that uses those new Cell expressions in the next release. So it's the same thing we do with other APIs when we're relaxing validation or adding support for a new enum value or something like that. It's like a 2-release rollout. And so Cell has ways to indicate which of the features you want to enable. And so they added something like being able to compare ints and floats. For a long time, you had to compare like the exact types. So they added a way to compare like an int to a float, and it would do a cast. And that there was a flag when you're setting up your Cell environment. You could say, I want to enable this. And so for our case, it didn't matter because that happened like before we enabled Cell in a beta. But if we had already enabled Cell expressions and we had to maintain like one version compatibility, we could have used that feature flag in Cell to say, like, don't let that data in for a release until we know we have a runtime that can interpret it. Rita, the stuff that's one of the benefits of doing it this way was that you don't operationally have to run a process outside the Kube API server, which is one of the pain points with webhooks. And so I think if we shipped it or tried to do some sort of plugin or separate process or something, I think we'd find ourselves back in a similar spot as we are with webhooks today. Now, in the development phase, I actually would like to see a webhooked version that can run these Cell expressions. So we did something similar with pod security, right? So pod security is a built-in admission plugin, but we also compile it into a binary that you can run as a webhook. So you could take that pod security logic and install it as a webhook on like 122 or 121 or 120 API servers. If we're wanting to do like rapidly experiment with Cell admission, having a way that someone could try it out on an existing cluster as a webhook, like I think that would be good in the development phase. Given that one of the goals is to not have to run webhooks anymore, I don't know that like long term we would want to do that, but in the early phase, that gets us a lot faster cycles, especially if we're just treating them as alphas, like alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha 3. Like use this, see if it works, like if the expressions make sense and if they let you do what you want to do. If this was built in, would it solve your problems? I think that's a great way to iterate quickly.
Yeah, that's what's really great. In fact, the first experiment we did when we did Cell for CRDs was we created the webhook and tried it that way, and then showed a demo of that, and then started working on the real thing. Other questions? One of the features I wanted to point out that we have in Cell that makes it a little different, at least for CRD validation, is that we allow you to access the object prior to the update that you're doing. So we call this a transition rule. So what that means is that you can not only see the current version of a field, but the old version. This makes it possible to do a bunch of things that weren't possible before, like immutability checks or have an append-only set as a rule. So this is actually a pretty powerful feature set. It's a lot of these use cases were possible with validated admission because you had access to the old object. But these rules express really nicely, and you get to inline them wherever is appropriate in your CRD. So if you're only concerned with one field, you just move the rule down adjacent to the field that you care about, and the rule is automatically scoped to that field. All right, well, thanks everybody for listening. I think that's all I had.
I was going to ask you a quick question, Jeff.
Sure.
So, you had asked, like what others might have as use cases. So I see Max is on the call. So one of the things that Max had asked to work on was one of the KEPs that's one of the areas for a SIG-AUTH that's open for KEPs and improvement is how we configure OIDC authentication to the API server today. So you can only have one today. We'd like to support multiple. One of the places within that I think could benefit for something like Cell is claim extractions from JOTs, as well as extra claim validation. Do you think that basically, barring roughly the 10-second token auth cache that's sort of built into the API server, would it be a good idea to run a Cell function basically on every single auth that's from a token that maybe matches a particular signing key? So
it's pretty fast. So one of the good things about Cell is that you can pre-compile it, and it basically builds an AST for you in memory. So you don't interpret from scratch. You can pre-check your program. So for example, with CRDs, what we do is when you first add this rule to your CRD, we type check it then, and we won't let you let you add a rule that's grammatically incorrect or that tries to access fields that don't exist into the CRD. So you get the kind of the static type safe environment, and then we pre-compile that rule, and then when we evaluate it later, it's actually pretty cheap for us to do. You kind of cache this little tiny programming environment that it needs, which is pretty lightweight, and so evaluations are really pretty cheap. So if performance is a concern, you'd want to check it, but it seems this is probably one of the better ways to go about doing something like that, at least in something that's dynamic.
I guess one concern could be is we don't know necessarily the schema of the claims in a JOT, since it can be arbitrary JSON. I don't know, maybe there could be some way to pre-warm some cache where you basically ask the admin to define what the schema of their ID tokens will look like, and maybe upfront tell us.
Cell can run in two settings. So you can run it where you give it specific declarations of your actual types, or you can just say that this is a dynamically typed JSON blob, basically. And if it's a dynamically typed JSON blob, you'll lose your type checking. So if you say .some field name, then you could potentially get a runtime error if that field's not there. Now, there is a has check that you can guard it with, but that's more error-prone code to expect people to get that kind of code right. So that's the trade-off. But I mean, if you're going to do dynamic value access, that's kind of what you signed up for. So probably not a big surprise. So Cell can do it. If you somehow can get schema information in there, then you could benefit from it.
So, and the dynamic access isn't significantly more expensive, actually.
No, it's not.
I mean, it's if you're passing in, a JSON blob, like a map of maps, whatever, like it's just doing map lookups to resolve those properties.
And it's still safe, right? It's not like unsound, or it's not going to get into.
No. I mean, it's like instead of getting a Boolean true or false value back, you would get a Cell evaluation error back. Like it's not going to panic. It just isn't going to evaluate to true or false.
And so you said you could also, you don't have to return true or false, right? You can get strings back, right? So for example, I could have a Cell function to fetch the username, fetch the groups, fetch the UID, so forth. Right? Like full claim extraction.
And you can mix and match. If say you had some information that you were passing to the Cell environment where the variable names and the type are known, you could give Cell the types for that. And if there was some field that was just JSON data, you can tell it that's just JSON data. And you can still say what you expect the expression to evaluate back to. You can say, I don't care, give me anything, or you can say, I know this has to be a string. Give me an error if this expression wouldn't evaluate to a string. And then it will do as much static checking as it can.
Yeah, the more freedom you give the cell expression, so like if it's just going to return a Boolean true or false, and you don't teach it about different object types, then you can really constrain the types of construction it's allowed to do inside the expression. For something like CRDs, that was pretty important to do to like keep costs down. If you were going to do something like in an authentication flow or authorization flow that's going to run on every query, you'd really want to pay attention not just to how expensive it was to like get into and out of cell, like the invocation cost, but like the complexity of the expressions you were allowing. So
yeah, and that dives into one thing that we hadn't talked about, which is we do have a cost estimate subsystem on cell. Because cell is not Turing complete and there's only certain ways you can do iteration. If we know some information about the data that's coming in, we can estimate a worst case running time cost. And we're doing that with CRDs, and we won't let you put a rule into the CRD that has like, you know, n cubed complexity or even n squared complexity. And so, you know, you can do things like say for each of the elements in a list, do something. And in the CRD, if you say the list size is small, we'll let you do it. But if you basically have an unbounded list, we're not going to let you do an n squared on that. So the nice thing is we have that in two forms. So we have one where you can estimate the running time cost statically, which works if you have enough information. And then at runtime, we also increment a cost counter as we interpret. And that is independent of your wall clock time or the machine it's running at. Any input with the same program is going to have the same cost, and so
you can bounce
that exactly. And you know, if you say there's a bounds and exceeds the bounds, cell's going to bail the moment it realizes that it's above the bounds, and it's going to stop evaluating.
Okay, but I mean, it sounds like if all you wanted to do was basically say like, okay, I got this string username. You know, it said it was Mo, but in this environment, every username is prefixed with foo, so it's going to be foo-mo or whatever. That seems relatively benign. Same with, and I could imagine validations that are basically like, oh, I see you're not in group X, and you have to be in group X to log into this cluster, so I'm just going to reject your authentication. You know, that's kind of the things I would hope to allow people.
Yeah.
Without.
Yeah. If you kind of look through some of the lists of some of the stuff we've supported in cell, I think you're well within the bounds of what we can do.
Yeah. Max, do you have any comments? I see you're unmuted.
Oh no, I was silent because it's interesting to hear some like professional comments. I was searching for my pull request, and if it's possible, I would like to show it to GP. Like
sure.
to have some comments from him.
Yeah, I think yeah. So I think the hope is we would, for that stuff, we would eventually get a KEP out. So either way, I think we could find JP and be like, hey, this KEP basically is abusing the hell out of cell. Please tell us if we've gone off.
Yeah, I think we're very happy to help anywhere where we're seeing cell being used. One of our goals in our first couple of releases was to integrate cell with Kubernetes as well as we could. So we gave ourselves a good baseline to build on. And when we did that, we were making sure we supported our immediate use case, but we were also thinking that like if cell were to use somewhere completely different in Kubernetes, would this still be sane? And we were trying to anticipate that and be very complete. Cool. So yeah, absolutely.
All right. Does anybody else have any thoughts on cell before we talk about KMS stuff? All right, cool. Thank you for joining us, JP. That was good stuff.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
All right, Rita, did you want to talk about KMS?
I think this is just open up for folks who have comments about the PR. It has gone through first round of review. I was hoping Mike would be on the call as well to see if he has any follow-up concerns.
I think,
Mike Denise is on vacation this week.
yeah, I think he's out of office.
Yeah, we just want to make sure this gets through before the deadlines, the kept deadlines.
Yeah, it looks like he is back next week. What is the kept deadline for 125? I think it moved out actually from
The 16th, the 16th of July. Sorry, June. Not July.
Not July.
I'm
You
hoping
wish.
July,
You
but
wish.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Mike is back middle of next week. And so that's a couple weeks ahead of the review deadline.
Okay.
If he has context on it, I'd probably get him to drill on it. Yeah.
Okay. I assume, Jordan, you don't want to sign up to review this along with Mike.
I'm happy to take a look if I have time. Most of the questions I ask on the KMS and gRPC stuff are like, here are questions that someone who knows nothing about this area would ask because I know nothing about this area. So I'm happy to be like a rubber duck API reviewer, but I think someone like Mike would have a lot more like actual knowledge to bring to bear.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think we'd like to have at least some more eyes on it just to make sure that our echo chamber has not resulted in something unsound. We're hoping for, implementable as an alpha in 125. Hopefully, iterate from there and get stuff in. But we are at a code level. I think what we want to do is something very deeply isolated from the existing V1 beta implementation to not only would it be feature flagged, but it wouldn't touch any of the.
Just be a parallel. It'd be like a V2, like separate thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that makes sense to me. Just looking at the motivation and like the high level bits, I'm hoping that it gives really good flows. Like one of the big problems with the first version was that it was sort of this single actor view of the world. And especially with KMS, like all the hard problems are when you're trying to coordinate like three actors, like the KMS backend and the API server config and the Kubernetes API clients, like those, all three actors. So sequence diagrams and swim lanes, yes. I'm so happy to see those. Yeah, good job.
I can take a pass through it as well, and see if some other folks at Google can take a look at it.
And not just the diagrams, but also what triggers each step. Like, how does one actor know that it's its turn to do a thing? Like that coordination aspect. And if that's out of scope of this, that could be okay, but just be explicit about like, this is not indicating how this will happen, just so we know where there are gaps. Because I think those gaps existed in the first version and is where a lot of the pain came from.
I think we do talk about the PR talks about what is the thing that is going to trigger.
Okay.
But if you see any gaps there, please definitely comment.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think we're very open to adding more diagrams. I feel like these diagrams are like significantly more like when you read the KEP, you're like, I don't know what this is saying, but you read the diagrams, like, all right, cool. Now I can go read the KEP again, and it'll make some sense. So yeah, I think if we need more diagrams to suss out like how is this the same as the beta API, and maybe where it's not the same. I think we're all open to that, and GitHub has made it a whole lot easier to have diagrams because you can.
I know, I love those. Those are
I know
so
it's like a killer feature. I just want my diagrams to not be pictures in my KEPs. It's much easier to keep them up to date.
One thing that came to mind was how we would migrate. Oh, I see. That's cool. That's like the last item in the goals section.
Yeah,
Alright.
the high level idea is you have the V2 API, assuming you go through all the effort, get everything done, it's GA, it's been GA for like at least 3 releases, then we can deprecate the beta one. But on any of those 3, or I guess at any point where you're comfortable with it being good enough, past beta, you could migrate using the existing storage migration mechanism, which you can specify
Okay.
along with the
So
beta.
this would slot into the existing transformation. None of that would change. So this would, you could just move this up to the top, and
Yeah,
it would decrypt with the old one and re-encrypt with the new one. Cool.
Yeah, so it's very much designed to not mess with your existing thing until you're happy to mess with your existing thing.
As it should be. And honestly, I don't know that we would ever drop the old one. I think we'd probably just freeze it and say, like, we know there are problems. This is the thing that fixes the problems. Like, the old one will just be there with its problems until you want to pick up this new one. Yeah, that reminds me of, it's basically in our storage path, and we don't have a storage migration story until we take responsibility for doing the migration for them to this new thing. I don't think we can drop the old thing. So as long as it costs us nothing to let the old one sit there, then I think that's probably what we would do.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is not only would this thing have to be GA for some time, but so there's some high level conversations in this that talk about how like automatic rotation and stuff could be done, but it's basically saying that the storage version API stuff has to be like not alpha and done, like, because I need that to be a functioning API for me to use it.
Yeah.
So I think what you're saying is in order to drop the old beta API, we would have to have both of those things GA functioning and automatically doing certain aspects, and then you may drop it. Which
Yeah, but the consequences of like dropping stuff before we know for sure that everyone has migrated their storage are just terrible. And honestly, like the cost of keeping the old thing sitting there, like, is as close to 0 as I could imagine. So
we are very good at ignoring it.
yeah.
So that's fair. Anybody else have thoughts? I think Anish, you had opened up issues to the GKE encryption at rest provider, and same for EKS as basically trying to probe like maintainers of existing. If anyone doesn't know, Anish is one of the maintainers for the AKS one, so we're well covered in Azure coverage, but we're trying to get GCP and AWS coverage too. Like, since those cloud providers have existing deployments, so they might have opinions and functions that they would like this to do better. Anybody else have thoughts, questions, or concerns on this? Okay. Cool. Does anybody have anything else, or should we give you 12 minutes back? All right, cool. Oh, I guess I was going to ask, I see Tahir, you're on the call. Are you targeting the CA stuff, which I can't remember the name of right now? Trusted anchor tests.
Yeah, I need to I've took a sprint test this week to do the revisions based on feedback, and I'll try to aim for the June 16th cutoff for that trust anchor set stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, I just haven't been working on it.
No, it's fine. I totally understand. it's like life. I see Jordan and Tim, you're both on the call. Is there anything we need to talk about PSA? Or are we moving along? Are we good there for 125?
I don't think so. The GA kept merged, so I think we're kind of good to go there. Not a ton of work that needs to go in for the next release. Like updating the APIs and a few other little things were called out.
The pod, this isn't blocking GA of pod security, but the pod OS field is also targeting GA in 125. And as part of that, they would be tweaking some of the pod security stuff so that some of the Linux only aspects of the restricted policy could be relaxed when a pod is explicitly a Windows pod. So that'll be sort of a quality of life improvement for Windows pods who are having to do silly things right now to say like, yes, my seccomp profile is runtime default, even though I'm a Windows pod, which is silly.
But I know almost nothing about Windows pods, but like that's like guaranteed to be true, right? Like when you're a Windows pod, you're actually a Windows pod, right? Like you can't like somehow.
Yeah, so the stuff was built into the kubelet. So that was what the pod OS field is doing. So when the pod OS says explicitly, I am Windows, then on the kubelet side, it actually looks, and right now Linux kubelets say like, if you're anything other than Linux, I'm just going to reject you. I'm not even going to try to run you. And Windows today can only run Windows pods. So today it rejects anything other than Windows. And in the future, there's a possibility that Windows kubelets will be able to run Linux containers. And at that point, it would then permit both of those, but it would use that field in the pod to decide which type of container it was going to run.
What's the oldest version of the kubelet that will reject mismatches, OS mismatches?
We waited to GA pod OS until we hit kubelet skew. So
okay.
2 versions ago, 123. That's why
okay.
it didn't GA sooner.
Yeah, got it.
Cool. Yeah. Mike.
All right.
Yeah, I think we're good, y'all. See y'all in 2 weeks. Yeah.
Smart.